Too Much is a podcast series proudly supported by Victoria Police, who are looking for more women to join their ranks. Consider making the switch and explore a career with Victoria Police. Visit the link in the show notes or head to police.vic.gov.au.
Formula One is an extreme sport. Even just through the sound of the car ripping through you, it was physical and it was visceral and it felt like the start of an addiction. It was hard to admit that it wasn't working out.
Every woman remembers a time they were too something at work. Too ambitious, too soft, too bossy. Hi, I'm Brianna Blackett, your host for Season 3 of Too Much, The Switch. I started out as a journalist. I lived abroad and travelled the world, helping to cover breaking news. I co-founded an international news organisation. But since becoming a parent and solo carer to my 2 kids, my working life has needed to change over and over again. And I'm not alone. Join me as I interview 8 extraordinary women who made the switch from one career to another and found success. We'll also find out how defying the suffocating stereotypes women face at work helped them get there. Picture this. A Formula One car screaming past at 330 kilometres an hour, the sound ripping through your body like a physical force. With that, Kate Reid was hooked, set on a path to become a Formula One aerodynamicist. Now, picture the perfect, buttery, flaky croissant, one so good the New York Times dubbed it the best in the world. Yep, that was Kate Reid too. F1 obsessive turned founder of the world-famous Lune Croissanterie. Throughout her career, Kate has perfected the hairpin turn. And though she's been labelled too lucky, today she reveals the grit behind every seemingly effortless pivot, the years of hard work, and how a battle with an eating disorder led her to the top of a pastry empire. Kate Reid, thanks so much for joining us on Too Much.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
This season we're talking with women who've made the switch from one career to another. So in your own words, can you share a little bit about your journey?
How about this? Formula One aerodynamicist to croissants.
Totally makes sense. And only an aerodynamicist would get from one point to the other so fast in so few words. It was very streamlined. Well done.
I'm sure you want to explore that a little bit more.
We will. We 100% will explore that a lot more. But you know what? While we're setting it up, what we're going to explore, let's take a look at your too much, because all the women on this program are too something and they tell us what their too much is. And for you, we've landed on too lucky. Why is this?
Okay, it's interesting. I think when I think about how the media have portrayed my career to date, it's typically a dot point version of you wanted to work in Formula One. You rode off to your favourite Formula One team, the Williams F1 team, and they offered you a job as an aerodynamicist, which was your dream job, at the age of 23. And then later on in life, you decided that you wanted to learn how to bake. And a little cafe that you loved going to, you asked if you could have a job there, and they gave you a job. And then you happened upon a boulangerie in Paris that was the best boulangerie in Paris, and you wrote off to the owner of the bakery and you asked if you could do a stage with him, and he said yes. And then you came back to Australia and you established your business. And all of that looks like everything I've done in my life has just transpired at the exact moment that I wanted it. And a lot of people say to me, so basically, every time you've asked for something that you've wanted, you've gotten it. I think for me, the best way I can possibly describe it is the way that I've done in my new memoir, Destination Moon. There's this one opening passage in a chapter where I talk about, embarrassingly, one of my favourite bands when I was growing up in my teens was Hanson, Mbop.
Yeah, exactly.
And really, especially when it comes to music, or maybe an actor that seems to go from complete non-existence to the hottest thing in the world, or a band, no one's ever heard of them, and then the next day suddenly they're number one around the world. But there's years and years of work, blood, sweat and tears, small failures, big failures, lots of money spent, lots of wishing and hoping and working hard to get to the point where they are number one. But everyone only learns about them when they become number one, and it feels like they came out of nowhere. And I think that that's a really accurate summary for my professional successes. The media love to focus on those Hollywood moments where I dreamt of working in F1 and suddenly I was working at my favourite F1 team that I dreamt of. But there was a decade worth of hard work, an incredibly difficult university degree, you know, volunteering at this Formula 3 team in Melbourne where I was bullied by the mechanics, and I had to get through all of that to get to that point. But I do think that there is this misnomer out there that I've just been incredibly lucky with my success in my life and my career. So that's my too much.
So your too much is kind of tongue-in-cheek, right? So, you know, being framed in a way that you just happened across these things and it just luck led you to where you needed to go rather than looking at the hard work that it took to actually get you even to the door before you could knock on it and it could open.
Yeah. If my story was a man's story, no one would say that the man was lucky. They'd be like, look what you did, look what you've created. But as a woman, it must be like, gee, that was like lucky that you got that and lucky that you got that. And it's like men deserve it and earn it and women are lucky when they get it. And that really irks me. I think that I wouldn't be the only one where anybody that makes it to a point where they have a bit of a public profile and they've succeeded in something, I think a lot of the public forget that there was just so much work behind the arrival of that moment where it's not easy to achieve and it's not luck that gets you there. I think luck and timing play a small part in it because my resume happened on the desk at Williams when they were looking for a junior aerodynamicist, and I think they told me that 3,000 CVs a week land on the desk at Williams. So how do you stand out? And I do actually think that a lot of people speak about, you know, in a negative connotation, like, how was it working in a male-dominated environment? But I actually think it was an advantage being a woman. I mean, when you're one of 3,000 CVs on the desk at a Formula One team, one thing that can make you stand out is your gender. And all the other CVs were likely, especially for technical roles, were likely going to be from men. And so maybe in that aspect, me being a woman made me stand out from the others, but I had the credentials and the experience and the volunteering and the degree and the 10 to 15 years worth of history and hard work to back that up.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that. Can you tell us a little bit about what it took to get you there?
Yeah, of course. A little bit of background. I think a lot of people want to know what first made me fall in love with Formula One. And for me, I've always been really close to my dad from a very, very young age. And I think early on, I cottoned on that a way to spend more time with Dad was to love the thing that he loved. And he's loved cars his whole life, and in particular, motor racing and Formula One. So early on, it was this opportunity for me to spend time with my dad. But then I guess it morphed into a passion and an obsession of my own, which really crystallised the first time I witnessed a Formula One car in person, which was the 1996 Australian Grand Prix. It was the first year that it was hosted in Melbourne, and Dad took me along to the circuit. And I think up until that moment, it had just been this, you know, passion and a hobby that I had with my dad that I enjoyed. But in that moment, I knew that I wanted that moment to define what the rest of my life was going to look like.
What does that mean? What were you feeling?
I really love that you asked that. I'm asked that question quite often, but really only recently, especially with writing the memoir, I've been forced to explore what the feeling was. I mean, I've never even dabbled in drugs. I don't know if this is a revealing podcast or not, but I think I'm pretty goody two-shoes when it comes to stuff like that. But witnessing the car in person for the first time, the noise that it makes when it's travelling at 330 kilometres an hour, driving past you only metres away, the sound of that car ripped through my body. And that almost sounds violent. And, you know, Formula One is an extreme sport in a way, you know, that really only 20 people get to experience the real dangerous nature of it sitting in the car. But as a spectator, you secondhand feel that danger and that exhilaration. And even just through the sound of the car ripping through you, it was physical and it was visceral, and it felt like the start of an addiction. And I think alongside having a perfectionist and probably an obsessive personality, an addictive personality is a close relation of that. My whole childhood, in fact, my whole life has been dot-pointed and dominated by obsessions, which really overcome my entire brain and start to define how I choose to spend my time, what I want to focus on, and where I put my energy. And for me, that moment witnessing the car in person was that first hit, and I just wanted to keep getting that hit.
So you had this sort of joint physical and psychological response to that moment that really fueled, no pun intended actually, your love of Formula One racing. So you put in the hard work, you got your degree, you put your CV in front of the right person, you got the job. What was it like actually working for a Formula One team?
Well, initially, it was like a pinch me moment, dream come true. I mean, I dreamt of working for the Williams F1 team for at least the previous decade, where that had really been my singular focus. And achieving that dream, walking into their state-of-the-art aerodynamics facility where they had 2 wind tunnels. It was brand new. The offices were sparkling. They had the best of the best. I think there's one thing about the well-funded F1 teams, and they're not short of resource. And as such, I guess the cars that we were working on were the pinnacle of the automotive industry. And a lot of the technology that was developed in F1 ends up cascading down into the commercial automotive industry to impact the cars that we drive on the roads. It was very obvious in that first week at Williams, there was a hyper focus with the staff that was probably the most noticeable thing for me from a colleague perspective. The office was silent for the long hours each day that we would sit at our computers. All you could hear was the tapping of the keyboard and the clicking of a mouse. There was very little conversation in the office, which was something I was surprised about. I think in that decade leading up to realising the dream, I'd had enough time to really daydream about what the reality of working in Formula One would look like. And for me, it was incredibly collaborative, the best brains in the business coming up with wild ideas and exploring them, breaking them down and realising them. And it felt like it was going to be very exciting for me. But the reality of the office set in quite quickly that it wasn't particularly collaborative and it was very hierarchical. So I'd come in at a junior level, and even though I had ideas of maybe what I'd like to test on the car, as a junior aerodynamicist, you weren't even invited to put your ideas forward. You were working on and realising the ideas of your senior aerodynamicist. And while from a personal perspective, I liked my senior aerodynamicist, he was a classic engineer. He was a terrible communicator, and he would present to me the idea that he wanted me to model using computer-aided design software, but he would never explain to me why we were testing it or what I was designing. And it felt to me like I only had a small piece of the puzzle, and I'm somebody that likes to understand and have control of something end to end. And it became clear that I was a small cog in a much bigger machine, and the much bigger machine didn't need me to understand the rest of the machine. And it was frustrating. And in the end, I started to find it a little bit boring, which is hard to admit. Like, it doesn't sound like working in Formula One will be boring, but I started to feel that.
So there was a bit of a reality check between what you're expecting it to be and what it turned out to be.
Yes.
What happened next? Because this is all about the switch and the pivot. What was it that led you ultimately to change?
I think for me, because I'd worked so hard to achieve this dream, and I'd essentially defined myself with Formula One. It wasn't just this thing that I wanted to do, it was my identity. And because I'd attached myself so close to it, it was hard to admit that it wasn't working out, and I clung on to the dream for as long as I could, even beyond the point where I knew that I wasn't happy anymore. And I think part of it was about me losing my identity, and there was also probably part of me where maybe the outside world would consider me a failure. If you met me when I was in my teens, I would tell you that I was going to design Formula One cars. I'd told everyone I ever met that that was going to be my thing, and I didn't want to admit that maybe I'd gotten it wrong. So I'm stuck in a job where I'm not happy. I'm not being fulfilled professionally or personally. I've separated myself from my entire support network, really, my family who I'm very close to, all my friends back in Australia. I've taken myself out of a country that I loved living in, and now I'm living in the UK with, it's dreary, long winters, which they don't make you feel happy in and of themselves. I developed depression and anxiety, which both went undiagnosed and unchecked. But the depression and anxiety ended up morphing into anorexia, which came about. I think a lot of people think that eating disorders come exclusively from body dysmorphia or body image issues, but I can only speak to anorexia because that was what I suffered from. But anorexia more commonly comes from a need for control, and often from people who do have that perfectionist personality that are very hard on themselves and have high expectations on themselves. And when big areas of their life are out of control, like mine were, you reach for two very simple things to control in your life, and that's what you eat and how much you exercise. It's a very vicious cycle. Not only were big elements of my life out of control, the thing that I'd obsessed over that had completely occupied my mind for more than a decade wasn't doing that anymore, and my head was empty of an obsession. And so the anorexia kind of locked onto that need for an obsession and took over where the Formula One had once been. And I became obsessed with perfecting my body, I guess. And you go through a phase where you're eating well and exercising a lot, and then suddenly you look incredibly healthy like an athlete, and you get compliments from people. And so there's that feedback, but then the compliments dry up because you've gone below a healthy weight and you're starting to not only look thin, but also unhealthily thin. And people are too scared to... It's easy to say someone's looking great, but you don't want to go up to someone and say, you're not looking great. It's not in the human psyche to do that. So I think people just stopped talking to me about what I was doing at all and avoided the subject matter. And that was good for me because I didn't want people to interrogate or question what I was doing, because for me now, the only reward that I needed was standing on the scales every morning and seeing that number get smaller and smaller. I guess I'd started to treat my body a little bit like a Formula One car. Like it was this thing that I was perfecting and honing and improving, quote unquote, the performance of.
It just sounds like you had so much going on, Kate. Your view of who you were, as you said, your loss of identity. Like, who are you if you're not this thing that you always planned to be? And then your sense of success and failure was all over the place, because on the outside you'd achieved your goal, but inside you didn't feel it. And then that loss of control, and then your attempt to gain the control back. I mean, how did you find your way out of that?
The story of how I found my way out of that is incredibly complex. But to break it down into the simplest pillars, I guess, I understood without being able to explain it to people that the only way I was going to stop letting the anorexia rule my life and probably eventually claim my life was for me to find something else that I was obsessed about again, that I could divert all my attention and my focus to, like I had with Formula One. And it was a bit of a race against the clock. With anorexia being a vicious cycle, you will just continue to get thinner and sicker. And I guess it got to the point where I was still living in the UK, working in Formula One, but my performance at work had dropped significantly. No one really mentioned it at work, but it got to the point where I fell asleep in a meeting and my boss got angry at me and kind of told me off about it. But I'd worked 5 days straight at an event with like a sum total of about 8 hours sleep over 5 days, and the event had been delivered well. And I think that was a breaking point for me. Mum and Dad would call me regularly, and I think they'd started to sense that I was very unwell and that I was very unhappy. And I think I was waiting for the moment where Dad actually gave me permission to let go of this thing that had meant so much to both of us for so long. So he actually said it to me on the phone one day, "Why don't you come home?" And that for me was the trigger that was pulled that began the very long, slow process of recovery. But when I came back to Australia, I understood, and this is the thing I couldn't explain to people, I understood that I needed to find something to replace that obsessive need in my brain that anorexia had taken over. And so I started this obsessive search for my next obsession. and I happened to land on baking. And it does sound incredibly ironic because to think about someone suffering from anorexia becoming obsessed with baking, a lot of people who don't understand eating disorders think that they're opposed. But when you're starving your body, all you can think about is food because your body's just constantly sending signals to your brain telling you to eat. And baking for me became the way that I could live vicariously around food and ingredients without eating it. Like I was engaging with this very scientific, methodical process through baking, which I guess pinged off all the happy receptors in my engineering brain, needing that very process scientific idea of baking. But then I also had this secondary moment where I'd take the baking into work the next day and I would see how much joy it brought my colleagues, and I lived vicariously through their joy. So I came back to Australia incredibly unwell, beginning the recovery from anorexia, but I had this idea that I wanted to pursue baking as a potential new career. And I got myself a job working in a bougie little bakery in Melbourne's southeast called Philippa's, and I was just working as a counterhand. But for me, it was enough to convince me that I loved being in the environment, and I was jealous of the pastry chefs out the back who were actually producing the beautiful pastries that we were selling. And that was enough of an indicator for me that this was something that I wanted to throw myself into in a more intensive way. So I convinced this lovely couple who owned a cafe near my mum and dad's house to let me do some of their baking at the cafe. And suddenly I had this opportunity to be baking in a professional capacity in a commercial kitchen for people. And it was really in that kitchen where I started to develop a healthier relationship with food. I wasn't necessarily eating it at the time, but the support that was given to me by the couple that owned the cafe, they made me feel safe around food again. And I kind of observed them engaging with food in a really healthy, natural way, which made me feel safer about doing that. And this was probably that inflection point of my recovery where I started to really be able to hone in on that obsession and that focus with baking. And it slowly started to take over the space in my brain that the anorexia had been residing in.
So you made this switch almost as a means to, it was a life-saving switch almost. Was it too much to say that? Because you needed to...
No, it was a life-saving switch.
Yeah. So at what point, Kate, did you switch from being in a period of recovery where this new obsession, as you call it, this beautiful world of baking, became something that helped you become a much more healthier version of yourself? Like, at what point did you think, actually, this is my new thing and I'm going to do this in a healthy way?
It wasn't ever a conscious decision, but I would say that that true moment of being able to move on with my life with a new purpose and a new passion and a new obsession was really the early days of Lune.
Can you tell me about Lune then? How did you decide that the croissant was going to be your new Formula One racing car?
So I was working at this beautiful little cafe with the couple, Mary and Al, and I was baking quite simple things like cakes and biscuits and tarts and things, and I was enjoying it. But again, going through university, I didn't dream about going to work for Holden to design door handles. I wanted to design Formula One cars. I wanted the most complicated, most difficult thing. And so baking the simpler things, it was making me happy, but it wasn't really fulfilling me in a way that I know I need to be fulfilled. And so my baking exploits started to extend to more complicated, difficult pastries. I was reading a lot about French pastry, and I'd borrowed this book from the local library. It was a beautiful coffee table book detailing 10 or 12 famous patisseries and boulangeries in Paris. And I got the book home and I randomly flipped it open to this double-page photo of pain au chocolat. And the photo was just so mesmerising that in that moment, it was like,
the racing car moment almost, where you felt it as you saw it.
It's so funny. I have done versions of this interview so many times, I can't tell you. Every single interview, I learn something new about myself or I make a new realisation. And this is so wild. Up until going to the F1 circuit for the first time, F1 had been a passion. And witnessing it for the first time in person, it became an obsession. And up until the moment of seeing that photo, baking had been this like lovely thing that I was doing that was filling my days, but it wasn't really fixing me. I hadn't locked onto it as the obsession, but that was the inflection point for me with baking. Seeing that photo, with a passion, I can be methodical and chip away at it, and it's part of my life. With an obsession, I become spontaneous and impetuous, and I do crazy things to make that thing happen. And seeing that photo, I closed the book immediately. I immediately knew I had to be in Paris. I had to go to that boulangerie and witness them for myself. So I closed the book, went straight back up to the group of shops where the library was, but I went to a travel agent and I booked myself a ticket to Paris. And I wasn't healthy. I'm sure Mum and Dad learned later that night that I'd booked the trip, and they're like, what is she doing? She's like 40 kilos. She can't go off to Paris by herself. But when I decide I'm going to do something, nothing will stop me. So I ended up in Paris visiting this boulangerie where the photo had been taken, and it was a transformative experience being at that boulangerie where for the first time I was witnessing Paris as a city, and I'd been there many times before when I was living in the UK working in F1, but I'd visited the city as an engineer. And for the first time I was witnessing the city through the eyes of someone that had this new obsession with food and pastry in particular. And I showed up at the boulangerie that morning, and it became so clear to me how crucial and central to the community this beautiful, humble little place was. Like, I joined the back of the line. I could tell that everyone in the line in front of me came there every day to have their morning ritual, and it was something that set them on the right path for the day, made them feel happy, and I felt like I was part of that ritual, and I was about to witness the thing that made their day special every day in a very small way. But when we add up small things that make us happy, they have a much bigger impact than I think we think, or than we know.
These are the things that actually add little moments of joy in our lives. Is what we connect to and lean on as we go through our day. So I completely understand what you're saying. Can you tell us a little bit how you learned to master the croissant? Because you didn't just go to this patisserie as a customer, did you?
No. So
it didn't end there, because it's Kate Reid. Of course, it doesn't end there.
So I had this transformative experience at the boulangerie, and it impacted me so much that I felt the need to reach out to the owner of the boulangerie the next day. And I didn't reach out to him asking for a job. What we've just been talking about, I was so aware of the fact that he'd created a business and a space and a product that was so many people's little happy moment every day, that I just wanted to write to him and tell him that I'd seen that. And then I got up the courage to ask if he would take me on as an apprentice. And the chances were slim. Like, I don't speak French. I didn't have a French passport. Had no experience working in Viennoiserie, which is the family that croissants are from. But God knows why he decided to say yes. And so a few months later, I found myself back in Paris, working in the best boulangerie in the city, and all of a sudden it was like I'd discovered the intersection of everything that I need to feel like I've got purpose in life. I was physically working hard with my hands, with a team that were passionate about what they did. I was creating baked goods, but not just baked goods. They were the most complicated technical baked good that you can. Like, they are the Formula One of the bakery world. That month that I spent in that boulangerie in Paris, I have never slept so well in my entire life. And I think it was like the tired that you earn from deep and utter satisfaction from how you've chosen to spend the hours of the day, like productively learning, feeling fulfilled, feeling happy, feeling challenged, all of those things. Anyway, I came back to Australia and I was ignited by this new obsession. And I obsessively searched around Melbourne to find a croissant that was anything like what we'd been making at the boulangerie in Paris, and it just didn't exist. And so I had a spark of an idea that, well, if they don't exist, I know how to make them. So maybe I'll start a business and I'll make them. I wanted to do what Christophe was doing with the boulangerie in Paris. I wanted to be making people happy. I wanted to give them that 10 minutes of joy every day, that thing when they wake up and it's the first thing they think about, like, oh, I'm going to go down and get a croissant this morning from that place. And it came from a very humble little dream, or I guess a desire to do that. So Lune was born.
For women who are out there listening to your story and are thinking to themselves, I would like to make a change, I need to make a change, what advice would you give to other women contemplating making a switch right now, or perhaps in the process of needing to make a switch?
What's funny, it wasn't a conscious decision on my behalf. I think it was inadvertently the eating disorder forced me to make the switch, which I guess maybe subconsciously I knew that I had to do if I was going to find true happiness in purpose. But now, having gone through that experience and survived it, I now know that if I am unhappy with some aspect of my life, if it's something that we have the power to change, then we should just do it. Because taking a risk to try something new that might make you happy is 100 times better than staying in the thing that makes you unhappy, because there is the chance that you will find happiness. And I guess going back to the theme of the podcast being too lucky, again, today we've spoken about the big dot points of my transition from Formula One to croissants. But I tried so many things in my period of recovery trying to find that thing, and a lot of them weren't the thing. And you don't know it unless you try it. But once you try something and you can identify that it's not your thing, go and try something else. Because if we don't keep trying to evolve and reinvent ourselves, we're never going to land on the thing that will bring us true happiness through purpose. I think the other thing that I'm realizing as I get older is that no matter how hard we try, nothing stays the same forever. Everything always changes and evolves. And as humans, we've got to be open enough ourselves to evolve with change. And one day Lune will be something that maybe doesn't fully define me anymore. And I'm already okay with that. It doesn't mean that I'm not putting everything into the business at the moment, because it's still giving me so much fulfillment and satisfaction through its purpose. But because I went through the experience with Formula One, I know that I can survive needing to evolve and change myself again. And there's kind of freedom and something exciting about embracing the unknown.
Kate Reid, that is such an incredible story. So much inspiration there to be drawn from. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Next time on Too Much, Gian Rooney, a gold medal winning Olympic swimmer turned macadamia farmer.
I felt like I was losing control of my own narrative. So I left a network contract, and for most people on TV, that is akin to death. It's like, how could you possibly walk away from time on screen?
Too Much is a podcast series proudly supported by Victoria Police, who are looking for more women to join their ranks. Consider making the switch and explore a career with Victoria Police. Visit the link in the show notes or head to police.vic.gov.au.